Welcome to the Journey podcast. Let's grow together and let's reshape the health and fitness industry for the better. Welcome back, episode 5 of the Journey podcast, and I am so grateful that you're here. I'm even more grateful if you've tuned in from episode 1 and you're still here. And I want to dive straight into it today. So I do. And I'm going to be covering, I would say, one of the more, if not the most, controversial subject on social media as a whole, even in the nutrition space specifically, even if you look at the research. I'm going to be covering one of the most controversial subjects that there is right now, and that is ultra-processed foods, or UPFs, as it's kind of referred to for short. And I'm going to be diving into all manner of things to provide what I would say is an overall insight that isn't laced with fear-mongering or abject denial, which I think that the unfortunate thing with social media is you get very binary opinions, very black and white opinions, and it's usually a response to someone else's as opposed to a fair overview of a certain subject. And so that's what I would like to do, and allow you to then make informed decisions in your own life based on this information, and to prompt you to go and explore it further yourself. I know people critique and poo-poo people who do their own research and things like that, but I always find the best way to educate yourself is not being necessarily forced information down your throat, but whenever something comes along in your life that actually piques your interest and that you genuinely care about, and you can go out into the world and look to explore that. Now, does that mean that you should go and start watching Netflix documentaries and reading very complex publications and studies? Probably not, because the Netflix documentaries are about as useful as a chocolate fire guard for the most part, because they are heavily biased and quite honestly misleading a lot of the time. And reading very complex studies is difficult for people who work in research. So for the average person who maybe has very little experience of reading clinical literature, it's not the easiest thing in the world. But there are narrative reviews that I do believe make these things more accessible. So it might be worth exploring those. There's plenty of books. And again, just be mindful of books as well, because again, you need to make sure that the author is not necessarily biased in one way or the other. But I am actually quite a fan of people doing their own research. I know that's not a popular thing to say, because I think that statement, do your own research, is sort of looked down upon a lot of the time, but I would rather people try and educate themselves than stay ignorant. So, but always be open to learning. Never be so fixed in your position that you would never bend from it, because that's not growth. That's not development. That's almost like a child throwing a temper tantrum. When someone tells you that your worldview might not be what you think it is, you should be open to listening to what they have to say. And then you can choose to change that or not change it based on what they explain to you, or, what their opinions are. Because again, that's just another person's insight. So it could actually layer on and provide further learning for you. Or it could be something where you could say, I hear what you're saying. I don't think that's correct, or I don't agree with that. I'm not going to dislike you based on that. I might go and pursue that further and learn more about that just to double check that. But it's better to approach it that way rather than to be tribalistic in your views, you know? So Jamie says that, but then he did a whole podcast about hating alcohol, for goodness sake. But anyway, so we're going to cover UPFs in the first half of the podcast. Second half of the podcast is going to be dedicated, and I don't want to spoil it for you at this stage, but it's going to be about a bit of a light bulb moment for me, and I think quite a pivotal realization for a lot of young people as they transition into adults, which not a lot of people actually do in this day and age. I think a lot of people find it very difficult to actually step into adulthood and to leave childhood behind. I know people who are older than me who are less responsible and who honestly conduct their lives in a way that would not be too dissimilar to a teenager or a university student. So age to me doesn't always lead to maturity. I know people who are younger than me that are plenty mature because they've had to go through some very difficult times. And that, I think, forces or forges you into something more. Now, it can break people, of course, but I do think that we do have more control over our destinies than maybe what we're led to believe. And I think it comes with this realization, although the realization itself can be a bit harsh. So it can, especially whenever you first come across it. But then the more that you kind of strip away that initial emotional response, the more it allows you to actually take full control of your life and to feel that sense of I am responsible for how this pans out. I'm not always in control of what happens to me, but I am certainly responsible for what I do about it or what I do moving forward. And I would always advocate for extreme accountability because I feel like that is the pathway to success for a lot of people. So let us dive right into it. Ultra processed foods without the nonsense, without the shenanigans, without the fear mongering. Let's get straight into it. The first thing that we need to touch on when it comes to UPFs is actually defining what they are because the term gets thrown around an awful lot. Um, but not a lot of people actually know what UPFs are, what would actually be categorized as a UPF, and also why that's necessarily a bad thing to begin with. Because I think the term bad gets thrown around, but it's meaningless an awful lot of the time because it's just a arbitrary label that always tends to lack context. So when it comes to UPFs and actually defining them, generally what is used is a classification system called the NOVA classification system. This is the most widely used tool for categorizing foods, and essentially it relates to how processed they are. So the NOVA system categorizes foods into four different groups. So there's unprocessed, there's minimally processed, processed, and ultra processed. Now, the issue with the NOVA system is that it's far from perfect. So it's often described as a bit of a blunt instrument, right? So the NOVA definition of an ultra-processed food doesn't actually necessarily comment on the nutritional content of the food itself and was never intended, the original author has even stated this, was so it's a bit like the BMI sort of side of things. I'll not talk about that day, but my little brain just goes off on tangents like that. But the Nova system was never intended to profile a food in terms of its nutrient content and never really meant to state whether a food was nutritious or not. So essentially, it doesn't distinguish between foods which are nutrient rich or nutrient poor. All it does is separate foods by the degree of their processing. And I'll go into why that's a bit of an issue and why ultra processed foods should not always necessarily be associated with being a negative thing or with the amount of fear mongering that I know is quite popular on social media right now. So, a simple example of this would be you take something like a fortified whole grain cereal, so something like maybe your shredded wheat, for example, which is, a really like a pretty good breakfast option, generally speaking, especially if you were to have that with maybe some milk or something. So you take something like maybe a whole grain cereal like that, or similar counterpart. Now that would be placed in a similar category in terms of the processing as something like a dairy milk chocolate bar. And common sense would dictate that those two things are not the same. Those two things would not have the same health outcomes if they were eaten in abundance over and over and over again. So UPF as a flat label should not always be seen as bad. And also, not all processing is bad. And this is something that I really wanted to touch on because I think we now associate processing as being a negative, which it is not. So just because processing is involved doesn't mean that the food is therefore bad, which is, like I said, a bit of a rubbish label to attach to things anyways. It doesn't mean anything. Just like whenever you say a food is natural, it's hardly natural, especially if you've got it in a wrapper. It doesn't grow in a wrapper on trees, does it? So just saying. But that tends to be in a lot of these labels. Processing can include a whole range of helpful and honestly health promoting processes and practices which actually benefit us on a public health level. So we can take something like the pasteurization process. That can help to reduce certain foodborne illnesses. I know raw milk is all the fad nowadays, but let me tell you, there are few and far between sources of, if you want to say, clean and safe raw milk. So you have to be very careful with that. You've got other processing practices like the fortification of foods. So look at things like iodized salt. You got the vitamin D, which has been added to certain milks. And then one of the big changes that has been made that has really had a massive, 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 massive positive impact on on public health in at least the UK has been adding of folic acid to flour, which we know is a critical element to reducing the risk of neural tube defects in infants. So again, not all UPFs are bad then under that umbrella. And then you could look at things like preservation practices. So like tinned fruit, tinned vegetables, those things help to preserve a lot of the nutrient quality of those foods and also help to keep them for a longer time. So that's going to be beneficial for um, not just storage, but also avoiding a lot of food waste and things like that too, which are it's pretty important given the current cost of living crisis and all the other host of issues that we have going on at the moment beyond just the nutrient profile of these foods. And then we have to look as well at the potential issue of over inclusiveness. So whenever you label everything as UPFs, you start to associate all of those things as being bad, like I'd said, but that's not necessarily the case. So, like a couple of things that I would sort of highlight under that bracket would be like protein powders, first and foremost, they are UPFs. You look at any data on protein powder, it's almost all positive across a whole range of different, um, you know, different styles of interventions and reasons for those interventions. So it goes far beyond just lean muscle mass. You're looking at recovery from, exercise performance. You could look at actually sustaining lean muscle mass for an injured person or an immobile person. They're often used actually in certain third world countries or places where there's ongoing famines to help to sort of preserve lean muscle mass and avoid the consequences of severe starvation and things like that as well. So again, and that's just scratching the surface, never mind looking at, body composition, weight management, et cetera, et cetera. So like protein powders, now not all protein powders are created equal. Let me tell you, there's plenty of cowboys in the industry that make pretty poor quality powders, but generally speaking, as a whole, as a UPF, are they bad? In terms of like for your health, you'd have to argue no. Then you could look at something like your plant-based milks, for example. So again, there's a lot of people who can't consume dairy but may want to have milk in their diet for whatever reason. So if you can get these, now I appreciate not all of these milks are again made the same. I think a lot of them maybe have ingredients in them that don't necessarily need to be there. And that is a perfectly fine argument to make. And that's more to do with holding producers accountable, which I think is a good thing because I don't want these people who seem to continually increase their prices but reduce the quality of their products to keep getting away with that. That actually really pisses me off, to be quite honest. Um, but I think generally, plant-based milks can be very helpful, especially for people who have chosen to follow a non-animal based diet for whatever reason, and especially if it's a moral reason or there's like a certain health concern with a number of animal-based products, like that's fine. And then you've got maybe things like frozen foods as well. Again, yes, they may be more processed, but the ability to preserve then that food and to keep that food for longer for families who, again, these foods often tend to be slightly cheaper as well on average. So you're able to keep those foods for longer, save a bit of money, save time from having to go to the shop, etc., and what have you. Like that's really helping a lot of families who, And I've seen some content where people are like, oh, well, you can still get a food shop, da 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 da. That doesn't account for the fact that these people have zero time. A lot of a lot of them are working 14, 15, 16-hour days when all things are tallied up, whether it be, the um unpaid labor that they do at home, whether it be the commute that a lot of them have to take because they can't afford to live within close to the city. So they have to travel hours and hours and hours, to a relatively minimal wage job, which is, I mean, those things don't add up, do they? Because then the commute should also factor into the wage. And so then the wage actually drops down further. It's the same sort of issues that we contend with when it comes to doctors, is like doctors work far beyond what they're salaried to. And so whenever you look at what they're actually making at the end of that, it's like, again, it's next to minimum wage. And it's like, so now you're going to ask these people to also cook regularly, every single day, or meal prep, or do these things when they might be limited on storage. They might be limited on skills. They might be limited in terms of their education, their socioeconomic status, or so it just doesn't seem fair to me to sort of, yes, like financially you could maybe get a shopping basket or a shopping trolley for the same amount of money, but just because you've got that food doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be of any utility to the person, or at least, you're going to make the most out of that. So I think we have to be very conscious of that. And that's not excusing people who aren't making an effort. That's for the people who simply are already tapped out. And that is quite a lot of people in this day and age. So again, the current ultra-processed food debate often overlooks these nuances, and quite a lot of the time it comes from people who actually work remotely, don't have families, don't have to commute, are very flexible in their day to day and are somewhat, I don't like the word privilege. I think it's thrown around a hell of a lot, and that's another thing that pisses me off. But the people who make a lot of these arguments do tend to be quite privileged without maybe acknowledging that. And I think that's important. And I think it does a disservice to those people whenever you paint all of these foods with the same brush and you actually make them feel worse for including these foods in their diet. Now, again, it's very hard to have a nuanced, balanced, objective conversation because people will get their hackles up about it, right? But I think you cannot always look at the world from your own personal view. You kind of have to put yourself in other people's shoes. And also one of the things that I wanted to touch on when it comes to this push to label all the time, and this maybe comes from my own personal experience, because I dealt with um so there's a condition called orthorexia. Essentially, it means then that you become hyperfixated on clean eating, for lack of a better way to put it, right? And I was obsessed with only eating a very restricted diet because I felt that there were so many foods that were bad. And I can't help but feel that the lack of nuance and context that surrounds the UPF conversation is probably impacting some people that might either lead them to or antagonize or even further the potential for them to either, you know, have or to fall even further into orthorexia style tendencies. So that would be another reason why I just don't like the binary conversations. Although social media kind of demands it because we like the extreme opinions. They rise to the top. You can't deny it. The loudest people tend to be the most extreme. They tend to have the least amount of flexibility with their opinions. They tend to be very one-track minded and they will argue to the hilt with the other team. And that doesn't really do anyone any good. I think this whole issue with the polarization of opinions has infected our culture to a degree where it's hard to see it ever coming back to common sense. And I think like politics is the best example of that. I think people have lost their minds when it comes to politics. They've lost it completely off the edge. They've absolutely lost it. There's a severe lack of common sense. There is a lack of communication. There's a lack of conversation, and there is a lack of compassion. And it is widespread, and it is infectious, and it is cancerous, and it is killing a lot of our society. And I can't help but feel that it has infiltrated the health and fitness space as well. And I don't know how much of that is driven by social media and the algorithm and what we demand and what we see and what we need. But I would always emphasize this. The best thing you can do, aside from putting down your phone and going outside and realizing that that little screen that you hold in your hand is not the entire world, nor is it the real world, the best thing you can do is to develop critical thought. Listen to both sides. Come up with your own opinion. That will put you in a good stead because that will mean that you don't fall into a tribe. Tribes are great when things are going well. When things don't go well, and I think we're starting to see this, particularly in the carnivore space now, where a lot of the original creators who pushed the carnivore diet have become desperately unhealthy and have moved away from it. People would rather see their health decline. This is the absurdity of it. People would rather see their health decline, their communities decline, their countries decline, than feel like they were wrong. It's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. I think we need to have a bit more humility. So we do. And really embrace being more open to learning. Usually the answer falls in the middle. It falls somewhere in the middle, not at the poles. And I think that's where we need to take that next step because I don't know what happens. I don't know what the next extreme is around the corner when it comes to health and fitness at least. I'm hoping that the GLP-1 medications and things like that are as extreme as it gets, but who knows? Who knows? Anyway, off the doom and gloom train. The next thing I wanted to talk about was actually what the data shows us as it relates to UPF, and how they tend to impact us on an actual health level and what may be the actual causes of those things, because I think that's important. The more that you can understand why something does what it does or why it has the impact that it does, then again, the more you can make an informed decision on whether you would like to include it or exclude it from your diet, from your life, right? So the first thing to note is to have a wee look at the observational data. So observational data means that we have not introduced anything. We're simply looking at certain variables in a large group of people to see, okay, well, what is the relative associative effect of those things, right? So, if people eat more ice cream, um, do they tend to have more dental visits? Something like that, right? But also these observational data are not always indicative of a link between these things. And again, you have to apply some common sense to that. So, like, say, for example, you take the same sort of like, you take that ice cream, for example, you see, okay, well, people who tend to, like, when ice cream intake increases, then we tend to see a direct link between that and planes crashing. I don't think that people eating more ice cream is leading to planes crashing unless the pilots are the ones who are eating more ice cream and they're eating so much ice cream that they are causing the the average amount of ice cream in a large group of people to increase. So they would have to have like their little room cockpit full of ice cream as they set off, which would make sense because they're either passed out from, I don't know, overdosing on ice cream, or they can't see the windows because there's too much ice cream in the cockpit. So not all observational data is useful for assigning, this is why this happened. But what we're using observational data for is to establish, is there a link or not? And if so, then maybe we can explore that further to see if there is a cause within that link, right? So there are many large cohort studies or observational studies like the UK Biobank study. There's the EPIC study. I think they've even used like the Nurses Health study. There's the Nutrinet Sante studies. There's tons and tons and tons of these large scale cohort studies, and they consistently show that as UPF increases and sort of reaches a point where it would be designated as higher intakes, there is a very strong correlate then with obesity, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, mental health issues, and even certain forms of cancer. But the problem with that, whenever you look into the causality issue with that, is it's not so clear that it's just the UPFs, because whenever you look at these studies, you look at the people who are included in these studies that have those higher risk factors, you tend to see that they almost always have lower socioeconomic status. They tend to smoke more, drink more, move less, sleep less, and tend to have, more stressful jobs. And potentially there might even be like some like familial links and things like that too. So these are all confounding variables that you would need to control for. And it's not so clear whenever you actually control for those whether the link is as strong then, right? So does that mean then that we can completely put UPFs to one side and say there's no issue? Not necessarily, because there is some direct controlled evidence, like where we have these interventions where we're directly looking and testing these things. So one that I've that I can recall that is quite useful to sort of go into would be the trial conducted by Kevin Hall and his team. Kevin Hall's excellent, by the way. So he is like a research rock star. So if you ever see him on the paper, chances are it's going to be a really, really well conducted paper. So I would highly recommend a lot of his work. But so they did a study in 2019 that essentially it randomly assigned two groups of people to either a UPF heavy or an unprocessed food heavy diet for 2 weeks each. So what they found was that the participants on the UPF diet, um, they actually ended up overeating significantly more each day. I think it was something like 400, 500 calories each day more on that diet and gained weight. Um, but what they also noted that this wasn't necessarily because of additives or emulsifiers or anything like that, but it was more to do with certain behaviors around the food. So eating faster, eating more in general because of the fact that they were eating faster, so um, they weren't reaching that sort of satiation threshold at the same rate as the group eating the less processed diet. But also, whenever you look at it too, those ultra processed foods tended to be more energy dense on average, and a lot more palatable as well. And that tends to be the big issue, um, where these foods provide a lot more calories, they're a lot more tasty, and we tend to reach our off switch in terms of, okay, I'm full now, a lot later. So we do because of the speed at which we're eating, because of the palatability, because of the energy density. There's a lot of things that come into play there when we're talking about UPFs and what might drive that we need to be conscious of whenever we do see that link. So what you can kind of extrapolate from that, and there's obviously there's a lot more research, but I just wanted to sort of highlight a couple of those things, is that UPFs are likely a part of the problem, but not necessarily the entire explanation for the poor health outcomes that we see that are rampant across the UK, Ireland, like all the world. I was going to say all the West, all the world. Like all the world is not a great place right now. So it's not, at least in terms of overweight and obesity and all the sort of the health issues that come along with. Um, so again, UPFs might be part of that puzzle, but I don't I don't want us to lose sight of all the other various factors that contribute to that, because then we might be creating a villain that, once we topple, doesn't necessarily solve the problems. Might improve them, certainly, but would it fix them as a panacea? I very much doubt it. And I think it might cause other issues elsewhere as well, in terms of food availability for, like I said, more impoverished people or people who are more restricted with time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, just to be conscious on that. And I think like a good example of that at the moment, and again, not to sort of go back to the well of politics, would be the Make America Healthy Again movement, which has received a lot of criticism because they're a good example of that, because they're focusing in on what would be relatively minor and inconsequential changes that might not lead to massive improvements on a public health level. So, like, say, for example, replacing seed oil, you know, with beef tallow for fast food restaurants, like, you're still eating deep fried fast food. It doesn't really make a difference, or taking out like the red additives and stuff and what have you. But I would actually argue that's a good thing, but again, it's like you're kind of missing the forest for the tree. Do you know what I mean? Like, it would be better if you could focus more on maybe like, I don't understand why this is not a universal thing. Why are children not provided with meals in school that are nutritious? Doesn't make sense to me. Like, why is that not a non-starter? Like, why is hospital food so awful? Like, it is terrible. It is terrible not just for patients, but for staff. I did my research project for my master's degree on the health status of the frontline NHS workers. Let me tell you, for being in the health service, it is the least healthy. It's probably one of the least healthy occupations in the world. Not only are they working shifts, which we know are just categorically dreadful for human health, but the food that they're consuming, oh my God, it is awful. The quality of it, the amount of sweets, the amount of chocolates, the amount of crisps, the rampant alcohol intake, and the availability of foods to staff is shocking. We always think that it's people bringing in tins of sweets and things, and yes, that does happen, right? And you can't deny that. So I don't know how you would impose any changes on that. But the actual food that these people are provided in their canteens is crap. For the most part, it's crap. And they're having to pay for it. They don't get their breaks. Like, whenever we conducted that study for my research project for my master's. Do you want to know what percentage of frontline NHS workers who conduct the weight management service for the NHS, do you want to know what percentage of those were actually overweight and obese? North of 66%. More than two-thirds. Two-thirds of those staff were overweight and obese, and they're telling people how to not be overweight and obese. Let me tell you, it was not a very efficient or effective service at the end of the day. In fact, it was a waste of time. So anyway, that's me rambling. That's me rambling. But one of the things I also want to touch on when it comes to UPFs is actually to look directly at the potential mechanisms. I know I sort of touched on them briefly there, but I want to dive more into the potential mechanisms and the reason behind why there may be some harms with UPF intake, because again, it's important to understand the pathways that might explain why UPFs are problematic. So then you could either adjust how you consume them in your diet, or you can make informed choices of whether you are going to consume them or not in your diet, right? So, firstly, like I was saying, energy density and the hyperpalatability of these foods. So these concoctions of fat and added sugars and salt and sweeteners and flavorings, whatever the hell they are. They're just called flavorings half the time on the labels. What they do is they make these foods these really highly rewarding, they dopamine triggering, just they send off little fireworks in your brain telling you it's a good time, and that in of itself can encourage a lot of overconsumption. So it can, especially if it's not controlled, it can encourage overconsumption. I think if they what do they say? It's like leaving a kid in a sweet shop or a candy shop. They have no control, and you see it an awful lot actually in adults too. And obviously, like I work with a lot of people who have very complex relationships with food. And so that rewarding element of that can actually make it very difficult to develop a healthy relationship with these foods and to have a controlled relationship with these foods and to include them in a way where it is more measured and balanced in their life. And so that's one of the critiques of UPFs. But we touched on that. One of the other interesting elements of UPFs is also the texture of these foods and how that influences eating speed. So a lot of UPFs tend to have a much softer texture, and the actual sort of like the structure of these foods, they tend to be easier to kind of break down, to digest, and ultimately because they are faster in our ability to do that, our ability to process that, you process it by chewing it, and things like that. That a lot of the time can actually bypass our natural satiety cues. So it can. So essentially people eat these UPFs faster, delays fullness signals, overconsume. It's really good. My brain's enjoying it. I keep eating more. All of a sudden, I repeat that day after day. I'm overweight. I'm obese. I'm immobile. I'm not well. That's what happens. And the reason when it comes to the food structure side of things is not just how they're engineered, um, by manufacturers, but it also has to do with the fact that a lot of them tend to be lacking in certain nutrients that you would find in less processed counterparts. So the big one for me would probably be the non-digestible carbohydrates, particularly the likes of fiber you would find in these sort of, if you want to say like more natural structures. Um, so what would be a good example of that? Fruit winders. And the only reason why I can recall these fruit winders is because like they're marketed to little ones, and we obviously have a little one, so you get bombarded with these things all the time. But fruit winders, are essentially like they're recomposited version of fruit. And you take something like an apple fruit winder, you're just getting a lot of like this mush, easy to consume texture that's sweet, that triggers parts of your brain, but you don't get the same like fibrous component of it. You don't get the benefits of consuming the apple skin and things like that. It's not as difficult obviously to break down because it's like a mush, like a gelatin mush. So that would be an example of that, and that can lead to, even if the relative sort of like the nutrient profile, if you're looking at the back of these things, the relative blood glucose response would be different, for example. That would have an impact on satiety cues, hunger, cravings, fullness, reward systems, this, that, and the other. And it's really important to be conscious of those. So you could either go with it, you could pair those things with other, more complex foods. Like, say, for example, you could take something like your fruit winder and just make sure that in their lunchbox they maybe have like a low fat cheese. So then that the high protein component of the low fat cheese would then provide a similar, you would hope, impact on the blood glucose response than if the food was intact and had that fibrous element. So you just have to be a bit more, not clever, but just be aware of what you're consuming and how to make adaptations around that. Um, You could then maybe look beyond the food structure and things like that, at some potential harmful benefits of these things. You then look at the additives and the emulsifiers, and I think this is where a lot of people get, their hackles up about it and understand it because when you look at the animal studies, a lot of these animal studies suggest that emulsifiers, particularly, and then you look at artificial sweeteners, like, oh, that's a Pandora's box. You look at the artificial sweeteners and then some of the preservatives that are used, a lot of those are associated with a lot of poor health outcomes. Now, the more interesting one that's kind of coming around at the moment is the impact that it can have on the gut microbiome, particularly sort of like having a disruptive impact. Um, there may be an argument to pose that these additives, these preservatives, they can have an impact on promoting low-grade inflammation, which is also a consequence of obesity as well, which again has been tied to a whole host of issues that we associate with obesity. And then it can also have an issue with altering appetite, and again that comes down to the sweeteners and how we respond to them. And you see that these sort of sweetened beverages and sweetened foods, we do tend to overconsume these, and that might be, in relation to appetite or reward signaling or things like that. So, um, and the difficulty with that is the human evidence isn't necessarily as clear and concise as the animal studies. But a lot of the time, when you look at the animal studies, the amount of these things that they're taking in is so impractical when compared to like if you were to take it and extrapolate it to a human model. Like the big one that everyone knows about is Coke, for example, right? And because everyone, became like terrified of aspartame whenever these sort of studies were published, must be well over 10 years ago by now. But essentially they found that aspartame intake was linked to increased risk of certain cancers in mice. So everyone was like, oh my God, Coke's out to kill us. I don't necessarily think Coke's on our side, by the way. But whenever you looked at those studies, those mice were consuming the equivalent, I think, of like 30 cans of Coke a day worth of sweetener. And when you take that and you look at it in an actual human model and try to repeat that, it's like people would probably drown faster in Coke than they would actually have gotten cancer from it. I would say that the big issue with a lot of those like carbonated beverages is the dental cavities, and the issue with that. I would also think that there probably is an influence on, your digestive tract. But then when it comes to weight management, we see that if you have these zero calorie carbonated beverages, and especially if you have them just before or alongside a meal, it promotes satiety. It promotes feelings of fullness for much longer, and it can be a really effective weight management tool. So again, it's all context dependent because there might be more reward in terms of health benefit from losing weight than there would be from actually removing that thing from your diet and then not having lost the weight, if that makes sense. Um, so there's a lot of different mechanisms to touch on there when it comes to UPFs that are important to know. And I just think it's important to understand them in their totality rather than just be afraid of them because of what they're called. I don't think that helps anyone. So I don't. But there are some, potential reasons that we should include UPS and not necessarily banish them, to the nether realm. I think that's on. Is that a Yu-Gi-Oh reference? A lot of you probably won't even know what that is. I'll never mention that again. But there's a lot of reasons why you might want to look to include these things. And again, this comes down to those socioeconomic and accessibility factors that I had mentioned before. So touched on earlier, affordability. UPS are cheap, they're calorie dense, shelf stable, they can survive for a long time, no food waste. Like these are all essential for families on tight budgets. I don't know what you want me to tell you. Asking people to just cook from scratch all the time ignores real barriers like cost, time, and energy. Never mind equipment, never mind skills, never mind any of that. So again, uh, always look at it through other people's lens as well. Um, you can then look at the accessibility element of that. So, um, in food deserts, not desserts. Food deserts, UPFs may be the only option. So these are places where it's very difficult for people to actually access food and for food to be stored or transported or anything like that. So you need food that's going to be very shelf stable, can survive for a long time, and can sort of contend with the really challenging circumstances of these food deserts. So demonizing UPFs for those people isn't really fair because there isn't an alternative. The alternative is starve. I don't think that's a good alternative. I think that has a fairly, you want to talk about binary endpoints, starve. There's a fairly binary endpoint to starving, and it is not being healthier, unless you're one of these fasting bros or whatever. But anyway, um, let's see what else. There's the risk of stigma attached to these foods. So these sort of like social media influencers who say that these foods are poisonous or toxic, that can really have an impact on feelings of shame, guilt, health anxiety, etc. And especially that can influence people who are in these low income groups. And they don't always offer realistic or even sometimes they don't even offer a solution to those people. So then what do? You just leave them feeling worse. You leave them feeling stressed, you leave them feeling anxious. It's not really doing much for their health. Instead of trying to educate them to do the best with what they have, you're telling them that what they have is not good enough and they shouldn't eat it. So what do they eat? Nothing. Um, and then I suppose the only other argument that I could think of would maybe be related to the equity in messaging. So, you know, stripping away the social media side, policy needs to consider that UPFs serve important roles in the food security for groups of people, certain groups of people. And and this is maybe why I decided to do this podcast, is I think a nuanced approach might focus on actually improving the quality of these UPFs and holding manufacturers and producers accountable rather than trying to eliminate UPFs altogether. Because again, I don't think that is a solution that is going to benefit the vast majority of people. Because our population, well, it's actually decreasing at the moment, but our population as a whole has probably exceeded our ability to produce and to provide less processed foods for everyone. So ultra processed foods are the solution. More processed foods are the solution. So instead of saying, I'm going to label it as this and therefore it is bad, instead of doing that, why not actually contend with these manufacturers, with these producers and say, we demand better. I don't need you to necessarily like stop making these things, but you don't need to fill it full of shite. Like actually make this something that won't have a negative impact on my health. And I think it always comes back to, what are we trying to get across that's actually going to benefit the most people? I think it starts there. I think it starts there with holding manufacturers and producers accountable. I think it starts with moving away from overgeneralized fear mongering around the term UPFs, because not all UPFs are made equal, and not all UPFs are a negative. UPS as a whole have probably helped more people than not. I do think, however, though, that pendulum has tipped. I think people are aware of that. I think people are having a lot more of these ultra processed foods now. And again, they're not having the whey protein powders. They're not having the tinned fruit, the tinned veggies. A lot of people are having foods that they rightly know are not great for them. If you're eating a diet that is rich in crisps, biscuits, chocolate, sweets, ice cream, pizzas, you know, you know that's not good. So don't start thinking it's the UPFs. You're the one who's making the decision to have those foods in your diet regularly. Now, there might be something that you need to work on if you have an emotional attachment to food and this is how you get through the day. you probably need to work with someone to kind of get through that. If you're feeling like you need to point the finger at something external, I would look internal first because you're at the end of the day, you're the one who's making the decision. And if it is a financial thing, again, there are better options that you could go for that don't require you to cook, that don't require you to spend time, that don't require any of these things that cost probably the same, if not less, that you're choosing not to have in place of these other foods. And again, you're letting your reward systems override your rational brain. And so you have to take control in those moments. So just be wary of that. Don't be so quick to point the finger at UPS if you're the one who's constantly making the poor decisions. That's a bit of tough love. I feel a bit dirty for that. I don't normally do tough love. Um, but yes, so that's me kind of standing up in defense of the UPS a little bit. But I've always said that with everything, context matters. And certainly with UPS, dose matters as well. Um, like the context around like the actual unique food selections, like not all UPFs are made equal. Like a high protein Greek yogurt that might have sweeteners. You get like these flavored ones now, like it's usually salted caramel, vanilla, blueberry, whatever. Like something like that is technically a UPF, but that's going to provide high quality protein source, plenty of vitamins and minerals, potentially added calcium, if not, naturally found calcium in the yogurt itself. And yet, despite it being a UPF and a convenience food, it's probably going to confer more health benefit than health detriment. Whereas you compare that to something like Kit Kat, sorry, Kit Kat, chocolate bar. Uh, that again, UPF, is that going to be great for you? Probably not. Is that down to you of making a poor decision potentially in your diet if the rest of your needs are not taken care of at that point? Yeah. So again, like the lack of nutritional upside is in that scenario is down to your choice and not having met your needs already. The food is neither good nor bad. The inclusion of said food in the diet is good or bad because it's around the context of how it's included. I think one of the other things that really matters too is, and it's one of the things that I think is probably most concerning for people, and this really relates to, again, context and dose. The proportion of the average person's diet, at least in the UK and Ireland, has now become dominated by UPFs. North of 50% of our calories are from UPFs, right? And that is what is frightening people, I think, because on a public, whenever you look at those observational data from before, you cannot ignore the fact that there is a link. Now, again, there are causal potential mechanisms for that link. Again, there's a lot of confounding factors, which I spoke about as well, but that is likely a bit much, right? North of 50%, probably a bit much. But how do we encourage more minimally processed foods? What would that look like? How do we get those things in there? And how do we do it in a way that everyone would benefit from it, not just a select few, the privileged ones who have more time, more money, more skills? How do we do it? I think that's the real big challenge that's ahead of people. Is I think we're recognizing that our food system has gone a bit skew with. How do you turn that great big oil tanker around? That I think is the real difficulty of it. So it is. So I just want to very quickly finish on just one final point on this. I appreciate that I've been on UPS for a long time, but I hope the conversation has made sense and the points are valid. I know I've repeated myself a few times, but I think whenever you're speaking at length for this long by yourself, you tend to, I think, what is that? Some kind of insanity. So, um, so I just want to finish on this, and this is more to do with maybe my my personal vision for the future of UPFs and where they could go and where I think that they would fit well within our society and how we can actually make these things and leverage these things as a benefit, net benefit, as opposed to a net negative, and to not let the social media machine spiral too far into the fear-mongering element where a lot of people will then feel worse off for having these things in their diet on a regular basis. So, but first and foremost, I think not something I would like. I think it's something that we need. It is a necessity for public health, is the demand for reformulation, sorry. Reformulation, not a word. Reformulation. I think we need to continue to put food companies under more pressure, and that's maybe where social media can actually make a difference to reduce adding sugar, adding salt, adding saturated fat, adding all these different things that doesn't necessarily need to be in there, but helps to boost their profits and hurt our health. I think we need to pressure them there, hit them where it hurts in their pockets, and you need to demand for more fiber, more high quality protein, more micronutrient content, more minerals. It needs to be something better because it needs to help everyone. And you can't just have like the UPFs that sort of meet that criteria, but are far outside of the price bracket of the people who may benefit from them the most. You know, like you're pricing like a protein bar is a good example of that. Although some people argue it's basically just a chocolate bar, although it does tend to have quite a bit of bit and beans. Bleh. It tends to have quite a few bits and pieces that might actually provide some health benefit. But these things are like £2.50, £3 a bar. That's a meal that could feed a family for some of these people on these um lower incomes. So again, there needs to be a push for this reformulation. We need to have better standards for these foods because I think if we don't, profits will continue to rise, and I think the general public will continue to be hurt by that. So I think we'll bridge into the gap of um, functional UPFs. So that could be products that are then becoming enriched with other elements. So like I would love to see more products enriched with omega-3s, vitamin D. Those are two of the key nutrients, vitamins, minerals that almost everyone doesn't get enough of. So if we can have more of those across more different products, I think that would be fantastic. If we had more maybe probiotics, prebiotics, if there was maybe more vitamins, minerals, um, etc. within these products, I think again that's going to be helping a lot of people. And again, how do we make that a possibility for the folks who need it the most? That's the big concern. That's the big concern. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more innovation on the plant-based side of things. I think the plant-based industry, for lack of a better way of putting it, has really shot itself in the foot. I think they've made these overly processed, like to the point where they are just vile looking meat alternatives. And again, I understand they might reduce environmental footprint. There's the moral issue. Um, they can help with moving into certain changes in dietary patterns and shifts. But you can't deny that a lot of those meat alternatives are it's very hard to pose a compelling argument for them being beneficial for health. They are some of the most processed foods you'll come across in the shops. So I think there needs to be more innovation, better ideas in that regard, you know. I think that the government should be getting directly involved. I feel like there needs to be a shift in policy direction, um, potentially to help to reduce overall UPF intake. or to push to create healthier overall UPF intakes, or sorry, to create healthier UPFs, or demand like, that you need to meet certain criteria for these products now. Um, I think that debate will go into really shaping our food system in the future. And I would certainly love to see that policy influencing um, the public health sector. Again, I can only speak from my first-hand experience of working in the NHS, in terms of that research project, that I think those people they were at their wits' end then. That was nearly 10 years ago. I can't imagine how bad it's gotten in that time, because it was awful when I looked. It probably has not gotten better. If anything, it has probably gotten much worse. They need help. Our government doesn't do anything. I'm not a huge fan of our government, to be quite honest. I'm not going to get into that today. But if you live in Northern Ireland specifically, you know that they're about as useful as a chocolate teapot. So, but we'll not get into that. And I think that the final wee point to touch on in terms of the future of UPFs is maybe just to look at our language around it. I think social media has really pushed this association that all things UPF are now bad, when in reality, whenever we go right back to the start of this episode, the NOVA classification, while it breaks things into those four groups, does not comment on the nutrient profile of those foods itself, the nutrient density being poor or good. And so you can have potentially a nutrient poor, minimally processed food and a nutrient rich, ultra processed food. And so you cannot just slap a label on it and say that's good, that's bad. Again, context matters. I will shout that till the cows come home. Context matters. Most people don't care about context. And I understand that, because context takes thinking. It takes thought. We like to have black or white, yes or no, on off. That's not how the world works. And that is not the pathway to you becoming the healthiest, happiest version of yourself, right? You need to develop the ability to think, the ability to make decisions, and the ability to think within the context of what your goals are, what your circumstances are, what you're being presented with, and how you can make the next best possible decision. You will never be able to do that if you're following a hyper rigid diet. You will never be able to do that if everything that you do is yes or no. You will never be able to do that if everything that you look at is through the lens of good or bad. I can speak from experience because I've done that and it did not work. I can speak from experience from all the clients I've worked with that it did not work. I can speak from experience of having looked at countless studies where none of that works. You have to be able to critically think. Critical thinking is such a gift. It's right in front of us, and none of us have the patience to take it on board and to develop it. But you should, because it will be very freeing for your life. So that's my rant over. That's a conversation on UPFs. I really do hope that that made sense. And now I want to move into the second part of the podcast, and very, well, not quickly, but I want to be more concise maybe with these sort of lessons at the end, and talk a little bit about one of the most pivotal light bulb moments for me when it came to transitioning from a fairly immature, non-caring, selfish boy who then had to move into becoming an adult, dare I say a man. Mustache isn't just for show. Can't even see it. There's a podcast what we're talking about, unless you're watching on YouTube. I want to talk about that. The sentiment I wanted to cover in the second half of the podcast is all to do with the fact, or the statement, that no one is coming to save you. And that sounds very harsh. So harsh that I actually had to think about whether I wanted to do that today on the podcast, because I spoke an awful lot about UPFs and how it's not all down to personal responsibility and things like that. But life is pretty brutal. It is not fair a lot of the time. Things will happen to you that cannot be explained, that do not seem to make sense, that seem to be cruel and unjust. And yet, one of the things that you have to realize, and this is not just for men, although I think it maybe does tend to apply a bit more to men than women, because we tend to be more isolated creatures than I think women tend to be a lot better at having social circles. Firstly, no one cares, which is sad to say, but no one cares. Well, very few people care, but generally speaking, no one cares. And then the second thing is that no one is coming to save you. You're struggling with your weight, no one's coming. You're struggling with your degree, no one's coming. You're struggling with your job, no one's coming. Struggling with your finances, no one's coming. No one is coming to save you. That, as harsh of a lesson as it was for me, was one of the most liberating things that I had to learn. And I know that like these are my opinions, right? These are lessons that these are my opinions coming from the life experiences I've had, the fairly brutal things that I've had to go through, the mistakes that I've made. I was someone who held out hope that something good was going to happen, that someone was going to fix all my problems. And it never happened. In fact, I wore a mask for so long, hoping that, you know, this was going to happen, that once that mask fractured, my life fell apart. And less than 5.5 years ago, 6 years ago, I did not want to be here anymore. And I very seriously contemplated that. And then I had to come to terms with the fact that no one actually cared, apart from a select few. And then I had to come to terms with the fact that no one was coming to save me, which again was another pretty brutal truth. And so the solution to the cure for that was I had to take my life into my own hands, start thinking about what I really want, who I want to be, and what I need to become to do that. And I think the first thing with that was needing to become self-sufficient. I couldn't be the boy anymore. I couldn't be relying on people anymore. Like I am not a child. That was one of the critical lessons for me. I'm not a child. No one is coming. There are people I could maybe rely on that could help me, but ultimately they could maybe only help me up to a point, and then I would be a burden unto them, and they wouldn't be able to help me. And so it was not a reliable path to take to do that. I know people do that. I would not recommend it. But it was so important for me to come to terms with the fact that no one was coming to save me because then whenever I realized that the person who could save me was myself, whenever I became solely responsible for taking that path, that journey, that's when things started to get better. That's when I was like, listen, if I want to come to terms with what I'm experiencing, with all the things that I've had to deal with, I'm gonna have to go to therapy. I'm gonna have to talk to someone. I'm gonna have to talk to a professional who can help me navigate through this so I can come out the other side. So I went and did that. And it was ugly and it was hard. And I had to talk about things I did not want to talk about. I had to explore things I did not want to explore. I had to look into the very darkest parts of me that I did not want to go into. But it helped because I did it. So I had to act first and foremost, but I did it. And I would ask other people to do that too. You have to not avoid that work. You have to do the work that you are afraid of, essentially, because it will just make things worse. It just festers. It just festers, and eventually your life will get messy and it gets worse. And it becomes a great big black hole that sucks everything into it. So you have to do that work. And then I thought, okay, I need a reset. I need to stop putting myself in positions where I am vulnerable and compromised, financially, security wise. And so when a lot of my friends were moving forward with their lives, getting married, starting families, having these high-flying jobs. I moved back home. I started my business all over again. I kept working with that counselor. I met with him a couple of times a month for the next 6 months. And I slowly built my business up. I started taking care of myself again. I started from scratch. I developed the ability to be humble, to have humility, and to understand that I don't deserve anything more than what I have right now. And in the future, I will deserve exactly what I have because I have worked for it. And that all came from the understanding that no one was coming to save me because I had to be the one to do it. And I don't think there's much really in this lesson today, other than the fact that I think whenever you come to terms with the fact that you are the captain of your ship, and no matter how stormy life gets, no matter how high the waves are, no matter how awful things can be, it's up to you, and you can do it. Because there have been people who have achieved things who have been in far worse positions than you to start off with. And it's not a competition, it's just a realization that there are no excuses for not moving towards the best version of yourself. You might feel like a miserable so and so now. That's not going to change unless you do something about it. It's the truth. And the best solution to that is acting and doing the work that you're avoiding, which no one wants to do, because that's why we avoid it. So it's not really much of a lesson today. I think it was more, I think we all have these little moments where it's like we're, stick or twist. You have to sort of take, like it's a fork in the road, you have to go down one. You don't have a choice, you can't stand still. And for me, that was a very definite fork. One of them, the road ended very quickly, and the other one led to the life that I have now. And I'm very grateful that I didn't take the selfish road, that I took the hard road. And I'm very excited for where that goes. I know that this podcast, this whatever you want to call it, is a work in progress. I know a lot of the times I don't make sense. Some of the times it's just cathartic for me to talk, like for something like this. But at the heart of it, I genuinely, genuinely, genuinely do hope that it helps. Seriously. And when I say that I'm grateful that you listen, I am grateful. I am very grateful. And when people message me and say that it has helped, you don't know how much that means to me and how pleased I am for you. Genuinely. So, anyway, the coffee is wearing off. It's been a long one. I hope it helps. Grateful that you're here. We might have a few guests coming on to talk about their stories and their lessons, their learnings, like really brilliant people. But I'd love to hear your views on the UPF conversation in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think about no one is coming to save you. It's a fairly brutal thing to say, but I think most people know deep down that it's the truth. So anyway, that was the Journey podcast, I would say episode 6, episode 5. I'm glad that you tuned in. I hope that it has helped you take a little step forward today, and grateful that you're here. And hopefully, I see you on the next episode of the podcast.